So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the Sony cameras and why a lot of people say that the Sony cameras have a little bit of a digital look to them and they kind of lack that filmic, cinematic look. I personally love the look out of the Blackmagic. It's very soft, pleasing, and it does kind of have this like cinematic element to it. I do tend to agree with the people that say that the Sony does look digital. However, I feel like I found a little bit of a workaround to make sure that the Sony camera looks very creamy, soft, filmic almost. So I'm going to be going over that today. Today's video is sponsored by Storyblocks, so thanks to them for supporting the channel, mate. Like, they're backing it. Do you know what I mean? I appreciate it. So let's take a little look at some footage that I just shot in South Africa with the Sony a7S Mark III, giving it that kind of filmic look to it. And I'll meet you back here in a sec. Yeah, let's do that. Oh, shit. What's going on, you lot? I hope you're all sweet. So, what do you think? Do you like it? I kind of like it. I'm going to show you some comparisons here with the kind of standard Sony image and then the kind of secret sauce recipe, whatever you want to call it, that I've kind of put together. Obviously, please bear in mind that looks are very subjective. Looks that come out of sensors are very subjective. People like certain images depending on their certain project that they're shooting. If you're shooting a short film, you're going to want that to look very different to how you're going to shoot a product commercial, for example. One of them's going to want to be really sharp, clinical. The other one's going to kind of want to have that narrative-driven look to it, whatever the DP or the cinematographer wants to add. So I'm going to go over what I use for the Sony, how I kind of get these images looking the way that I like them right here, and hopefully you guys can get some benefit out of it. So the first thing that I like to do is everything we can possibly do optically and in camera. Number one, that's getting the most amount of dynamic range out of this camera, and obviously we're going to want to be shooting in S-Log3. I think we all know that. Very, very obvious. A more filmic, cinematic look doesn't clip highlights. In my opinion, clipped highlights just screams digital camera. It screams like phone camera. You know, as soon as them whites are banged up and clipped, game over, looks dreadful, that is straight up digital. Some softer, more lowered highlights gives kind of this softer, more cinematic, filmic style look, in my opinion. Next up is your sharpening. You want to turn down sharpening on your camera as much as possible. It's actually called detail. So you want to bring down your detail as much as you possibly can, all the way down to -7 in camera to get a really soft, sharp as hell clinical looking shot. We want to keep it nice and soft. We can do any sharpening in post if we really want to do that, or if some of you have misfocused, you know, like, does happen. Next up, and in my opinion the most important element, is what we put in front of our glass. That is going to be a diffusion filter. Boom. This is the Black Pro Mist. This is actually the quarter Black Pro Mist. I personally think that the quarter is a little bit too much. I think that the 1/8 is a little bit too less, but the quarter's a little bit too much. So if Tiffin kind of want to make a little bit of a 1/6, I think a lot of us would be very happy. I'd be happy about that. I know a lot of you know what a Black Pro Mist is, but for those of you who don't, let me tell you. Basically, it softens the image. It kind of takes off that edge of the sharpness. It also blooms highlights. Now, blooming highlights is more of an effect. I personally am not massive on the whole blooming effect. The Pro Mist blooms a lot. If you check out that light there in the corner, boom, boom, you can see how much that blooms. I personally don't like that extra blooming. I'd quite like if you could have like a separate filter just for the blooming and another one that just kind of brings down the sharpness. The diffusion filters also bring down the contrast. So the image is less contrasty, them highlights are less spiky at the top. The highlights are a lot softer and the skin kind of rolls off, less sharp, and it's a much more pleasing image to the skin tones. And it also helps your highlights to have like a nice soft roll off. And in my opinion, it gives the illusion of more dynamic range, even though you've not got more dynamic range. You just don't see that really hard, here's your highlight, here's your next color. It's a much more softer gradient out of that and just gives the illusion of more dynamic range. So in my opinion, the Black Pro Mist is probably the best one-stop shop thing that you can do to give your Sony camera that little bit more softer cinematic look to it. I'm gonna whack this back on because like, I'm looking a bit dodgy. I'm not gonna lie, this is kind of like a really strong diffusion filter for this kind of setup. Should probably be using the 1/8, but here we are. Right, so let's jump over to the edit so that we can see what we can do to the image in post to try and give it, you know, more that filmic quality in that. So over here on the left, we have our completely standard Sony shots, and over on the right, my man just taking in a little bit at the moment and that. Not sure what I'm doing there. Let's get on a different frame. Definitely not that one. That one will do. So we can kind of like completely differentiate the two shots right now in terms of the standard Sony look and the more diffused shots that I've got with the diffusion filter on. This on the left-hand side is that Sony S-Log 3 with the sharpening all the way down. Same on the right, the one on the right's just got the diffusion filter. I cannot find a frame here where I don't look like I'm about to fall asleep. Right, so this top layer here is simply just our color grade. As you can see there, that is just the straight standard S-Log 3 footage. I probably could have exposed it a little bit more to the right if I'm honest, but let's get that grade on. There we go. Quite a nice, simple looking image, nothing too fancy. You can see that everything over on the right is just a little bit softer, a little bit nicer. That's kind of the image. Cool, go on. Have a go. They look like they're about to have a little scrap. Obviously, we don't condone violence on this channel, obviously. So let's pause this at a element and we can have a chat. Right, so there we go. You can straight away see that over on the right-hand side, our contrast is down ever so slightly. If you check out over here on the Lumetri scopes, you can see that our highlights have been brung down a little bit and our blacks don't really look like they've changed much on the scopes. But if you look at the blacks down here compared to the blacks down here, they've definitely kind of lost a bit of contrast. And you'll also see that the contrast between my bloody forehead, my meathead, and the black here, that's a lot more contrasty than here because the highlights on my face are actually blooming. You probably can't see. If I take off the grade, like my t-shirt is like glowing because this bloody 1/4's heavy as fuck. So you'll be able to see that contrast difference between these two. And if I zoom in about 400%, you'll be able to see that sharpening has just been taken off. It's just kind of like chipped off that sharp edge while still retaining the details. We don't want to completely ruin the details. We just want to take off that extra bit of sharpening that we can see. So next I've got a bit of an optional extra for those of you that want a really kind of soft and filmic look. And that is simply adding a little bit of a blur to the image. So if I whack this on here, and we give that image a tiny little blur. I like to go anywhere between 1 and absolutely max 2. You don't want to go past 2. You're going to look like you missed focus and you're going to look like an idiot. And you're actually just going to take off all of that detail. Remember, we just want to take off the sharpening. We don't want to take off the detail. Now, a lot of people aren't going to want to do this, and I understand that. I would only really use it in extreme circumstances because as soon as I've uploaded it to YouTube as well, YouTube completely destroys it and it takes off that kind of digital sharpening anyway. So for those of you, depending on where you're going to actually view this particular piece that you're doing, that will depend on if you actually want to add a bit of blur in there or not. When I look at this image here playing back on the program monitor in Premiere Pro, I much prefer that look with a little bit of blur on it. I actually like about 1.3. That's kind of the sweet spot for me. Now when I play that back, I really like how this is looking. It's just a little bit softer, not so sharp, and I personally love a soft image. Like back in the day, I was all about how sharp is this lens, how sharp is that, sharp this, sharp that. Now I'm like, mate, give me the most scrubby, like characteristic lens you got. So for me, about 1.3 is kind of that sweet spot. Definitely test where you're actually going to put your content. If you're going to put it on YouTube, for example, you might not want to actually add any of that. Right, so the final kind of secret sauce recipe, what's the fucking word? Ingredient, how hard was that? I'm 28, I can't even think of the word ingredient. The final ingredient to having this filmic, cinematic element to our Sony footage is grain. film has this really nice organic grain to it. It looks a bit like noise, but it's not noise. It's film grain. It's like a characteristic of the film. And in my opinion, it looks beautiful. I really like it. It gives a filmic look. I don't know how else to explain that. I don't know what filmic means, but it looks like film. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit. Oh, that's the wrong folder. You can't see that one. That's a secret folder. It's not. Just don't want to. I don't know. Right, so I'm going to add a little bit of grain here. I've got some 16mm grain. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to add that over onto the right-hand side. Now, obviously, that don't look great because it's just a load of grain. And if you need some grain elements, I do actually know a site. What's that site? It's like blocks and they tell stories. Storyblocks. So if you don't know Storyblocks, Storyblocks is a huge library of online stock video and online stock assets. They've got over 1 million different assets that you can download completely royalty free, and they can be used for any kind of use. Commercial, corporate, private use, you know, for those of you that like to keep your stuff private and that, I understand. YouTube content, Instagram, the whole works. Storyblocks have got a variety of different subscription plans for any kind of needs, whether you're a solo shooter or you're a big media house. They've got really affordable subscriptions for everyone. And my good friend Daniel Schiffer is doing a collaboration with Storyblocks to give you guys the opportunity to win a whole year of Storyblocks subscriptions along with a ton of camera gear. So I'm gonna leave a link in the first line of my description so that you guys can go and check out that edit challenge. I really recommend going and checking it out. There's a lot to be won, and it should be pretty good fun as well. So back to the, you know, secret sauce of goodness. So as we can see over on the right-hand side, that kind of film element doesn't look particularly great right now because obviously it's just a flat, like, digital image of film. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to overlay, and we're going to come down here. Our blend mode is going to be overlay. Now you can obviously see that the film has integrated itself into the image. Looks beautiful. Not going to lie, it's a little bit too much for me, a little bit too stylized. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that down. I usually like to go anywhere between like 40 and 60. Don't really need to go much higher than that. Just want to kind of give it that little bit of grain, that little bit of character, almost that like you can touch the image, you know, just makes it look a bit filmic almost. So as you can see in this, if I zoom all the way in on here, the film only really stays on the highlights. If I jump over to the shadows, you can't really see it. So when you use that overlay, it is kind of just going to hit them highlights, and in my opinion looks a bit better because it kind of disguises that. It doesn't look like noise. If there was a load of, you know, grain in the shadows, it'd probably look a bit like noise, and obviously we don't want to make our grain look like noise. Obviously we can kind of like dial this into however we want. Like you can add more grain, add more diffusion, add a little bit more blur if you really want to. There's loads of different things that we can adjust this to depending on the project, depending on the glass that we're using. Different glasses, sharper, they've got different elements to them, different characteristics. So I like to kind of blend this in dependent on the project that I've got. Sometimes I don't like it at all and I want to keep my image looking very flat, very sharp. That kind of Sony straight out of camera look on the left-hand side over here. I love that look. It just, sometimes I want to add a bit of a cinematic, more filmic, softer highlight, softer look. Apparently, this is what I was reading. If you don't like this video, you shoot in auto. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll be catching Hugh lot in the next one, mate. Bosh.